Now, I'm going to say something that is pretty obvious to most of you, even those who have barely been here. I am a pretty heady guy. I don't mean by that a smart guy. I just am all up in my head all the time. I like to think about things, but most of you already know that. And we've spent the last 2 months talking about our mission statement, which is worship the King around the table for the life of the world. We've gotten there primarily through our gospel lessons in Mark chapter 6 and John chapter 6, and we've seen that in the last couple of months that the connection point between our mission and the Bible in both of these chapter 6s, in Mark chapter 6 and John chapter 6, has been bread. It's been bread, a lot of bread. It's been a lot. Now, thankfully, Jody has placed an ultimatum on me that I cannot talk about bread anymore, okay? So be thankful there's not a lot of bread. I say not a lot, but I'm going to get to that. As if in answer to Jody's plea, over the next several weeks, our lectionary reading, so those who organize this lectionary across a bunch of different churches, they skip over every text in Mark 7 and Mark 8 that talks about bread. And so the lectionary reader said, man, there's been too much bread talk. Let's just keep going, much like Jody has said. I used to be really angsty about this, like, you can't skip the Bible, you can't skip the Bible. I'm more okay with it. I actually am more okay with it. But at first glance, our gospel lesson from the beginning of Mark chapter 7, which I just read amidst the people this morning, at first glance, it doesn't mention bread, but it's actually mentioned twice, okay? So I had to at least say this, because it's usually left untranslated. It depends on, we read from the English Standard Version, but most translations don't translate bread in these verses. But since Jody is serving in nursery this morning, I feel free to speak about bread for just a little bit longer, okay? So this isn't a bread sermon, but I gotta show you. Look with me at verse 1 of Mark chapter 7. Now, when the Pharisees, and so you can read that. Don't read that as bad guys. I don't know if you have that in your imagination. Oftentimes we read Pharisees in the church, and we think all of those really awkward, terrible religious people. Maybe they were sometimes, but they're not always that, okay? So Pharisees could just be well-meaning Bible Christians or something like that. So when the Pharisees gathered to Jesus with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of Jesus' disciples ate the breads with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. And skipping down to verse 5, and the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but with defiled hands they eat the bread? So it's kind of an awkward way to talk about that. When artos is mentioned, it's perfectly okay to just say eat, because bread was a part of so many different meals, okay? But I just want you to notice this, because it is really important for understanding the transition from our mission statement conversations over the last couple months and into this conversation. Our text is still centered upon the question of bread, but there's a turn here, and we're going to make that turn this morning. Particularly, the bread question is a question about religious practices, or else preparation, or if you're thinking about the Old Testament, you're thinking about the temple and all these sorts of things, about laws of ritual purity, those things that the priests and the people had to do before they went to church. They had to clean up in certain ways. It was appropriate to do that. So it's talking about, not bread in particular, but preparation, ritual purity, and then defilement, or at least this sense of being dirty, the sense of, I am unclean, I need to be washed. So the question of our text isn't, what's the bread doing? It's, and here's the question that I want to reflect on this morning, how do my external actions, your external actions, relate to myself? Those things that we do, or else things outside of us that affect us, how do those relate to ourself? Another way to say this is, can externalities, external things like eating bread, can it change us? Like eating bread and drinking wine, does it change us? And maybe a related question is, should these external things, like eating bread and wine and gathering together and not washing your hands, or these sorts of things, should they change us? Should we look to them to change us? Now, I have a little bit of pet peeves that I have to bring up here this morning. If I've made eye contact with you this morning, I'm not talking about you. These are just sort of general pet peeves that I have. And this first one is going to relate to Premier League soccer. But you could translate this to maybe a former and now disgraced ex-West Virginia basketball coach, okay? So I don't get that in your imagination. You probably know what I'm talking about. I get frustrated. Here's my first pet peeve, that the Premier League, and this is the highest division of soccer in England, I get frustrated that the Premier League thinks that if we only take a knee before a soccer game, and take a knee against racism, they say every time a game starts, if we put a patch on our shoulder that says, I am against racism, then over time, we, the audience, or else those in the crowd, will get rid of racism in soccer. I get a little frustrated with that, and we'll talk about why in a lot of different ways this morning. But this external, and it's so, I'm serious when I say this, I'm being real serious, this external religious observance will solve the problem of racism. Okay, so that's my first pet peeve. One more pet peeve, I'm going to just get a little deeper. Hopefully you're with me, okay? I don't know if you're with me, who cares? This is my pet peeve, it doesn't have to be yours. My problem is with a bigger problem, and this is the definition of what a problem is, the problem that needs to be fixed. In other words, is our problem an education problem, or is it a moral problem? Let me illustrate this for you. If my child doesn't know how to do algebra, it's not a moral problem. They don't know how to do algebra. I don't hold that against them. And therefore, how do you solve this problem? You educate them so that they can solve the algebra problem. Okay? So that's not a moral argument. It's not immoral to not know algebra. Can I get an amen, kids? Okay? It's not immoral, but is racism, is my feelings of angst or hatred, or my sexual temptation, or whatever it is that like algebra? Can I fix that by thinking rightly? By educating myself? We are told this. We're told this 1,000 times a day in 1,000 different ways, that we don't need to bring categories like sin or guilt or shame or anything like that. That's sort of like a religious problem. Our problem is a problem of education. And so if we just think rightly, then we can fix ourselves, like it's algebra. If people only knew that racism is bad, then there would be no racism anymore. If we could only educate the voters, if we could only have catechesis or better catechesis or adult discipleship classes, if I just take a knee, if I just wash my hands before dinner, then I won't get sick. If I just believe the right things, if I reject all that fundamentalism and I go to a church where we have wine, if I say grace before meals, if I do fill in the blank, if I think or I re-educate or I educate myself, or, and here's maybe a more dangerous problem for a lot of us, if all of that external religious observance or all those re-education programs and all those other things, that's just a bunch of Pharisaism. So if I know that that's Pharisaism and I don't do it, if I know that, then I don't know that if I know that I know, there's no way to get out of this. There's no way to get out of this if I just believe hard enough that I can't do anything good, or else if I reject the lies of Hollywood elites and liberal media. I don't know if I've pushed any buttons on anybody here. I don't need your re-education. In every direction, we can't seem to escape. So there's some pet peeves. I hope maybe I pressed a little bit for somebody this morning. The last time I preached this text, several years ago, I was reading the 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. This week, I wasn't reading Kierkegaard other than reading that old manuscript. I've been reading Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft. I've also been reading a Reformed theologian, Tim Keller, who was quoting Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I don't think I said that right. I was also reading a 52-year journal from an 18th century guy by the name of John Wesley about Christian perfection. And all of them, all these people, all these really heady people, were wrestling with, how do I balance these feelings that I have inside me and all these things outside of me, these externals like thinking correctly, education, or else the actions that I do? How do all these things relate to following Jesus? They're all wrestling with it in a different way. And as many of you probably know, all those guys are all a bunch of guys who think completely different about that. Even as I get so frustrated by everyone on social media or else in real life talking about educating myself so I don't do or say bad things anymore, I fall so easily and quickly into the same trap. And it's the more subtle and dangerous religious education trap. If I could just teach this well, then we wouldn't be trapped anymore. If I did my job well, then everything would be all right in our lives. So what's the way out? Can external things, or should external things like my actions or else my education, should they change us? That's the question I think that our text is reflecting on this morning. Most of us don't read 18th century or else 19th century philosophers, but if you go to your podcasts and you go to YouTube channels, they are debating the exact same things, whether with a religious veneer or a political veneer or whatever. This is the conversation. Some people say everything inside you is good, and then maybe you think they're the good guys, maybe you think you're the bad guys. No. Everything inside you is bad. You're totally depraved. Deep down, you know that you're a fraud. And then someone responds maybe with something like, baby Christians aren't perfect, but grown-up Christians should be perfect in thought and deed. And then another person says, you are always defiled inside and outside. There's nothing you can do. And it's sort of this back and forth all the time. And we seem to be talking past each other. Can external things change us? Well, I want to look, and maybe this is a fool's errand in my imagination, but rather than sort of giving you a bunch of things to believe, like I'm going to educate the masses here this morning, and if you hear and believe everything that I tell you, then your life will be easy. I don't think that's necessarily the way to go, but I do think that there is a way out, and I think the way out is with a Christ-centered imagination. And one of the things that our gospel lesson is, it's a lot of things. It's not so much an argument as an experience of an encounter with Jesus. Okay, so when I say that, this is how a story changes you, not how a argument changes you. It's not a list of all these things that change you based upon, now I can put all these things in order and I understand it all. It's more like looking in on a story or else hearing a conversation about someone's day, and that helps you get to know that person. So I want to tell two stories. One is I want to retell the story in our gospel text this morning, and I'm going to translate as I retell it. Okay, I'm going to translate as I retell it, and then I'm going to tell another story from literature to hopefully help us understand. And here is the point. I think here's the point. I know our mission series is over, but right here in our text, I think we see the end of mission. How do we think about mission, or else focusing on mission or other things like this, externalities, things that maybe aren't at the core but are right around the core? So look with me. I'm going to tell a story of our gospel text first. Look with me at verse 1. The Pharisees and scribes, they gathered close to Jesus and his disciples to question him. And in verse 2, they noticed that Jesus' disciples did not wash their hands with water when they were distributing all of the breads to the 5,000 in the desert. Now, why is this important to them? Verse 3. Here's their explanation, as if to say, in the Bible, God commanded the priests of God and the people of God to cleanse themselves as they came, to wash as they brought sacrifices for the people. And it wasn't really about cleaning their hands. That wasn't the point, although maybe that's helpful. It was about obedience. It was about ritual purity, Jesus. God wants us to take seriously the feasts in the temple, so he told us to clean up before we came, to wash our hands, to prepare ourselves before we came to the feast. The theology of that ritual washing, they would have said to Jesus, in preparation for the temple feast, it shouldn't just be for that one feast. It should affect all of our life, not just that one feast. The laws of God in preparation for the feast should affect all of our little feasts. So that's what we do, not just on Sunday, not just on the Lord's Day, but every day we wash our hands, and we wash our cups, and we wash our pots, and we wash our copper vessels, and we even wash our dining couches. That's a lot of detail. That's a lot of detail. This mission gets into all of our lives, they say. This is our received teaching. This is how my mother and my father and our elders taught us. This is our mission statement, maybe. We worship the King around the King's table, and we make sure that we're prepared for that feast. Not just on Sundays, but every day. We take it seriously. We take the theology of this table into our homes and into our own tables. And in verse 5, they ask the question of Jesus, why aren't your disciples as devoted to the mission as we are? They're Sunday-only Christians, is maybe a way to say that. When your disciples eat the bread, they don't wash their hands. And in verse 6, Jesus responds. Pay attention to this story. Jesus responds to their devotion to theologically sophisticated mission. He responds like this: it sounds like you guys are just a bunch of stage actors. Your theology is great. Your mission statement is spot on, but you've missed the point. You've missed the point of theology or mission. You've missed what mission is aiming towards. From Isaiah's day until now, Jesus says, all of that is supposed to make you humble and lead you into feasting, not to focus on the feast, but to focus upon the person who is hosting the feast, to focus upon God. You are so focused on your traditions, on your extra things, on your mission, on whatever it is, that you stop listening to the God of the mission. You've missed the point. And so they responded to Jesus in verse 11. Jesus, I don't think you get it. I don't think you understood what I was saying, okay? I don't think you got my point. Let me educate you, Jesus. Let me educate you some more on our mission statement. You didn't get it. All of this is from God. All of the things we've been talking about is from God, but it's not just about bread. Not only do we wash our hands like the priests in the temple, we give all our time, We give all of our money. We give all of our service to the mission. We give all of it. Everything that we have, we give it. We give it. Whatever gain we have, we count as loss, Jesus. We have given everything to this ministry. We've given everything to this mission. And how does Jesus answer? I will grant that you are devoted. I'm going to grant that. You guys seem to be very zealous, devoted to the mission, but that's my point. You've given all your time and money and energy to these other things that might be around, and they might extrapolate, and they might be important in many ways. But because of this, you have neglected your family. The very thing that God told you not to do. Don't neglect your household. You've been so focused on your ministry, or else on the mission of God, you've forgotten to listen to and obey the God of the mission. In verse 14, Jesus continues, everyone gather around. Everyone gather around. This isn't just for Pharisees and disciples and super Christians. This is for baby Christians and for curious people who are outside of the people of God, or for grown-up Christians. This is for everyone. Listen to me, Jesus says. None of this matters if it doesn't lead us to God. All of these external things are not the point. Your fancy, theologically sophisticated, sacramental theology or mission statement are not the point. This is not about bread or ritual purity or tradition, or if you're frustrated with politicians or Anglicans, it doesn't matter if you devote yourself to sacramental or Reformed or Wesleyan or whatever kind of theology, or if you think you're that rare person or that mythical person who can hold all those things together. All of these externals will ultimately amount to you distracting yourselves. You will focus on those things. You will think about those things, and you will think that they are the thing that makes you alive. Traditions and practices and mission statements have their place, but they're not the point. And then Jesus makes this turn at the end of this conversation. The point of ritual purity laws was not to fixate our attention upon ritual purity any more than my brushing my teeth and taking a shower to go on a date with my wife is about telling her about all the cleanliness things I did because I respect her and I want her to love me on a date night. That's silly. The point of the bread is not to fixate upon the bread. The point of the mission, the point of the traditions, and it doesn't matter what your tradition is. Is it sacramental Anglican theology? Is it KJV only? It doesn't really matter. The King James Bible points to God. The Anglican prayer book points to God in Christ. The purpose of the traditions is to point you to God. He is the point. That's the aim. That's the goal. To be with Him and to listen to Him. Very end of this conversation in verse 20, Jesus gets down to the heart of the matter. Every one of you, Pharisees, disciples, it doesn't matter who is hearing, all of this is so hard for you to understand because deep down you are sinful and broken. You focus on all the externals, whether they're good externals or bad externals, whether they make you frustrated, they're a pet peeve of yours, or they're central to your identity. You focus on all these externals, and you distract yourself from the point. And He says, stop. I have come to make you clean. Stop focusing on those things. Look at me. Come back to me. Stop looking at all that stuff, all the externals. If you think that's the point, get rid of it. all of your internal angst and shame and sin and brokenness. So whether you distract yourselves with things outside yourself or things inside yourself that distract you from approaching God, come, he says. Come to me. I have declared all things, including you, clean. Look at me. This is the first story. This is our Bible story. And at the risk of trying to just break down everything too much and maybe miss the point, maybe you're having a hard time putting yourself into that story because maybe it's familiar to you, or there's just a lot of Bible language that distracts you, or else it's just hard to follow. You don't exactly know what they're saying back and forth. I'm going to tell a second story. And I think this communicates everything that Jesus is trying to communicate to the Pharisees and to the disciples and to us here this morning. In other words, I think this communicates what we should feel in the presence of Jesus in the midst of a conversation like this. If we were to encounter Jesus this morning, individually and all of us here together, if we were to be face to face with him and not simply just talking about things about him, not just doing an education exercise, but really be in his presence, what would that feel like? And I always go back to a story from one of my favorite stories, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And if you've never read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I'm gonna spoil one of the most bestest scenes in all of literature, okay? And I mean that seriously, the most bestest scenes in all of literature. It's about everyone's favorite character, Eustace Scrubb. And if you know who I'm talking about, you know, okay? Eustace Scrubb is the worst. He is everything that is wrong with me on my worst day, and your worst day, and your worst, everyone's worst day, all balled up into one, and then put like a whiny, prepubescent voice with that, who wants everything hand-fed to them. Okay? All right? Can I get an amen? That's Eustace Scrubb. Okay, so this guy is in this story a lot. And he's very self-centered. He's very, very focused upon himself all the time. And long story short, he finds some treasure, and he puts this treasure on his arm. He puts this treasure on his arm on this forbidden island, and he goes to sleep, and he wakes up, and he is a dragon, okay? So there's the whole book for you, right? Okay? There's the whole book, according to Eustace Scrubb. He wakes up as a dragon, a boy who used to be a boy, and now he's a dragon, and his arm hurts really bad because he had a bracelet on his arm that was meant for a human, and now he's a big dragon. And so his arm is killing him. It's killing him, and he is having a hard time. He's having a hard time wrestling with himself, his dragonish self. And finally, Aslan, who is a lion in this story, he is a Christ figure in this story, he comes to have a conversation with Eustace. He comes to him on this island, and Aslan asks him to follow him. He asks Eustace to follow him, and so they walk up a mountain. They walk up a mountain to a spring in the midst of a mountain. The water is bubbling up in this spring, and Eustace he's at peace in the presence of his king. He's there with him. He doesn't quite know what's going on at this point, but he goes there, and he wants to. His arm is burning, it's aching, and he wants to jump into this spring so that he can be clean, so that he can be rid of this angst and this pain inside of him. But Aslan says, you must undress first. So he's sitting there in dragon form, okay, right? No clothes on this guy. And he's like, I don't know what he's saying. I don't know what the lion is asking me to do. Maybe he's saying, and he uses his imagination, well, snakes shed their skin. Maybe dragons do too. So he starts to tear at his skin. And so here is the conversation. This is Eustace Scrubb. This is not in the midst of that scene. This is him talking about that scene much later in the book. He's describing it to us. In many ways, this is kind of like the conversation that we've heard here this morning in the gospel. This is what Eustace said. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on, when I suddenly thought that dragons are snaky sort of things and snakes can cast their skins. Oh, of course, thought I. That's what the lion means. So I started scratching myself, and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper, and instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off beautifully, like it does after an illness, or as if I was a banana. I love that. In a minute or two, I had just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was a most lovely feeling, so I started to go down into the well for my bath. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and saw that they were all hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly, just as they had been before. Oh, that's all right, said I. It only means I had another smaller suit on underneath the first one, and I'll have to get rid of it too. So I scratched, and I tore again, and this underskin peeled off beautifully out. It peeled off beautifully, and out I stepped and left it lying beside the other one and went down to the well for my bath. Well, exactly the same thing happened again. And I thought to myself, oh dear, however many skins have I got to take off? For I was longing to bathe my leg. So I scratched away for the third time, and I got off a third skin, just like the two others, and stepped out of it. But as soon as I looked at myself in the water, I knew it had been no good. And the lion said, but I don't know if it spoke. You will have to let me undress you. I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you. But I was pretty nearly desperate now. So I just lay flat down on my back to let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. You know, if you've ever picked the scab off a sore place, it hurts like Billy. Oh, but it is fun to see it coming away. I know exactly what you mean, said Edmund. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done it myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt. And there it was lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there was I, as smooth and soft as a peeled switch and smaller than I had been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now that I'd no skin on, and threw me into the water. He picked me up and he threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. After that, it became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm. And then I saw why. I'd turned into a boy again. You'd think me simply phony if I told you how I felt about my own arms. I know they've no muscle and are pretty moldy compared with Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them. After a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me. Dressed you? Said Edmund. With his paws? Well, I don't exactly remember that bit. But he did something or other in new clothes, the same I've got on now, as a matter of fact, and then suddenly I was back here, which is what makes me think it must have been a dream. Here's the question. Can external things change us? Can our actions, or else other people's actions directed us, whether it be education or acts or works or these sorts of things, can they? I think the question is yes. The answer to the question is yes. We're right. We are so right to look outside of ourselves for help, for something else, because we don't know how to deal with what is inside of us. Not something, though, but ultimately for someone. We can't avoid the inner angst, no matter all the things that we do. We can't avoid grasping for something new to think that might fix it all, or else some new theological system, or a new podcast, or a new practice, a new religious observance. We try new things all the time. We try atomic habits or liturgies, and we live stream it before everyone else around us to inspire them to do these sorts of things. Private habits or public practices or kneeling at church or on a soccer field. We want help from outside of ourselves. We try these externalities, and they ultimately can't satisfy. But we desperately need help. I don't think you need convincing of that. I don't think we need convincing. We already know. We desperately need healing. And the only answer is an encounter with the King. Is to be face to face with the King and let Him do His work. Don't worry about the method of His healing. Don't focus on how the doctor gives the medicine or even what the medicine is. Focus on the healer. I think that's the invitation. Stop focusing on everything else, and as much as you can, be in that place on the mountain by the spring where He heals you in His presence. So I want to invite you, as we come out of this mission statement, to not think about our mission statement anymore. Don't think about externalities. Don't even focus on bread or the sermon or even sort of the text as a distinct thing outside of us. But what are all these things intended to bring us into? Into relationship with our King, into His presence. We don't need me. You don't need me. At the end of the day, you don't need, and I could think of so many Johns, John Calvin, or John Wesley, or John Mark Comer, or John MacArthur. There's a lot of Johns. There's a lot of Johns out there. You don't need them, and you don't need me. We need to come into the presence of the King, even as we declared in Psalm 15, to come into His tent up to His holy hill. And imagine this holy hill with a mountain spring, and there lift up our hearts. Lift up our hearts and lift up our hands and lift up our eyes and encounter the King. And so that's my invitation for us this morning, to come into the powerful presence of God in word and in table. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.